Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for my LPL week number 6 overview and analysis video here in the spring split. It's finally time for the LPL part of the week where we get our big video out. Obviously a ton to cover here today, as there always is, but we're getting closer and closer to the end of the group stage here. Group Ascend and Group Nirvana are wrapping up. In fact, Group Nirvana is going to be wrapped up by the end of this video. We're going to know everything to do with Group Nirvana moving forward, who's going to be qualifying for the play-in stage, and who will be done for the year. Not quite the same thing for Group Ascend, but we're definitely getting closer and closer to figuring out where these teams are going to land at the end of the split. I'm excited. I hope you guys are as well. If you are, let me know down in the comments section below. What did you expect to happen this week, and did it live up to your expectations? Always curious to know your thoughts and opinions on that front. But without further ado, let's get into the content itself. If you are new here, what we are going to do is go series by series, talking about the advantages and disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the series and a dud of the series for each series that we cover, and at the end of the week, I will be giving a player of the week and a dud of the week to tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. We will, of course, also be updating my personal power rankings from number 1 to number 16 at the end of the week. We don't discriminate between Group Ascend and Group Nirvana. It's kind of been, top 10 is in Group Ascend so far, but who knows? That might not necessarily be the case if I genuinely believe that one of the teams in Group Ascend is worse than, some of the teams in Group Nirvana. It's certainly not out of the realm of possibility, so stick around for that, but most of today will be spent talking about the series that we got this week. So, without further ado, let's get into day number 1. As per usual, 7 full days of action to cover in today's video, so I don't want to waste too much time. Starting off with day number 1, we had a really interesting Group Ascend matchup to kick off the week that really matters for the standings. It's FunPlus Phoenix taking on Team WE, and we win once again. WE are going to pick up the 2-0 victory, and while Assume did put in as much effort as he possibly could in the bot lane for FPX, probably playing his best series of the entire year up until this point with how critical I've been of his gameplay, WE is still able to come out on top as they're just a tad bit more consistent in the end, and that really is the gigantic difference maker. Some positives and some negatives to talk about for WE, but again, even just talking about them as a team that theoretically can, be top 6 or top 7 in the LPL is absolutely ridiculous. Incredibly fun stuff overall from them. So let's go ahead and go over it. Player of the series for me is going to go to Monkey in the jungle. Really cool to see the Trundle in game number 2. We don't really ever get to see Trundle in pro play anymore as a, quote-unquote tank counter pick. Like, you're picking it specifically to go into a lot of these other gigantic frontliners. But even in this game, there's not really a lot of great targets to steal. I didn't really love the Trundle pick, but it ended up really working out. And I think more so Monkey is getting this player of the series for that game number 1 on the Pantheon that he just completely ran. It's just very clear to me who the best player on WE is. I don't even think it's up for debate. A lot of people really like Tyun down in the bot lane. Vampire, I think, has been playing a lot better. The bot lane in general has been playing a lot better, but Monkey is clearly the best player on WE, and his, insertion into this lineup and his aggressiveness that he's brought with it have really changed the dichotomy of what WE is as a roster, and I think he was by far the better jungler here today. There was a gigantic jungle gap, in my opinion, in terms of the tempo and pressure that was being generated by both of these teams, and Monkey is a big part of that. So credit to him for both the Pantheon and the Trundle game, again, both of which I thought were very good. I also would be remiss not to mention a couple of other members of this team. Cube ended up getting player of the game on the broadcast for game number 2. It was an okay game from the Ornn. Those ultimates were big, and I do understand why they might have stuck out more so to some of the voters who were voting for MVP on the LPL broadcast, but to me, I didn't really consider it. He was mostly weak side tank duty and playing for team fights. Totally fine to do on Ornn. I'm certainly not going to be frustrated by that, but not player of the series worthy. And then Tyun and Vampire continue to be fine, even if there was a clear 80 carry gap in this series, and Tyun was not necessarily on the positive end of that, all things considered. Vampire is getting better. I think Karis is starting to get a little bit more comfortable in the mid lane. WE just feel like they're figuring something out, but playing through their jungler, who has been their best player so far in 2025, feels pretty easy to me. And I think especially with them doing that, there's no reason for them not to be a top 7-ish team, a team that absolutely can get side select going into some of these play-in matchups. And then for FPX on the other side, this team is better than I think we expected them to be going into the year, but they're certainly not perfect. Like, there's a lot of problems that they have, and I'm going to continue saying the thing that I said last week when it came to FPX. This is a team that's going to be very good at beating up on other teams that make mistakes and aren't playing their best best, but if the enemy team comes out and executes their own game plan, FPX is not the kind of team that's going to have the firepower to be able to compete with that. Their big strength is that their floor is relatively high. I just think their ceiling is relatively low, and, you know, if the enemy team's not screwing up, I just don't think FPX is really going to be all that much of a contender, but we can talk about why. First of all, Shadow is going to get done of the series here. Shadow's been fine over the course of this split, a bit feast or famine, maybe more so than he has been in some previous splits, but overall nothing really gigantically negative. I think getting out jungled on the Fury in game number 1 is not ideal, and the Xin Zhao game in game number 2 could have definitely been better, but I think that there have been worse performances over the course of the last couple of weeks from other junglers. I just think he was probably the worst player on the Rift in a series where both of these teams kind of just did their own thing. WE was just a little bit better at doing their own thing, but how do you not shout out Assume down in the bot lane as one of the first players to, you know, call out? He gets a pentakill on Misfortune in game number 2 and still loses the game. It has to be incredibly tilting for that to be the case. Jue, of course, has been probably the best player on FPX. Not probably, almost certainly the best player on FPX over the course of this split. Sheer was kind of taking that job, I think, for a majority of the beginning of the year, but Jue has been unreal in Group Ascend so far, and once again, I feel like a lot of the playmaking that Jue is able to do sets up the rest of the team well. I'm not a big fan of Assume. I think he's been pretty boosted so far in Group Ascend, but if you wanted a showcase for what it can look like at its absolute best, this is it. That being said, in the final fight that ended up closing out game number 2, he was wildly mispositioned and ended up not really being all that effective, but he got a pentakill on Misfortune. I can't really be all that upset. He played pretty well here, and Jue also played pretty well. Care is just... he's Care. Like, I'm not going to be particularly impressed, nor am I going to be like, this guy sucks. He's just the definition of a league average mid laner in the LPL. He can take advantage of bad players, not necessarily push good ones. And I don't think Sheer is quite in the form that he was at the beginning of the year, but it's still not really all that bad, all things considered. For FPX, again, this is just a more expected result, not because WE is way better than them, but because WE showed up today, which means that FPX loses. And that's really kind of the big difference maker for this team in general. But it's a nice win for WE. They continue their hot streak, and I believe this is who this team is at this point. They're a borderline top 6, you know, probably top 7 team in the LPL that's going to be finishing somewhere around there, and they absolutely should be a team that you could theoretically expect to make playoffs. Then moving on to our second series of day number 1, and we got a bit of a personal rivalry here now as we had Bilibili Gaming taking on Thunder Talk, and Bilibili Gaming is going to pick up the 2-0 win. They're going to dominate this series, and this has quietly become kind of a rivalry in the LPL so far in 2025. Not only were they in the same group in the winter split when we were talking about them, that's where Thunder Talk pulled off their gigantic upset win in a best of 5 when it was single round robin in that group. They meet again in the playoffs where BLG gets the last laugh by absolutely decimating Thunder Talk. They play earlier this split. BLG looks a lot better once again, and then they look so good that they actually end up taking Thunder Talk's jungler away from them. Beixuan, of course, going over to BLG to be their new starting jungler. Thunder Talk replacing him with Xiao Huanggren, somebody who's been in the organization for what feels like ever. It's got to be at least half a decade at this point. I mean, genuinely a ridiculous amount of time. People have been talking about him forever, and of course we will get into him as we go throughout this series, but we always start with BLG because once again they do end up dominating. They look like the better team by a very, very considerable margin, and it all comes through the same ways that they've beaten Thunder Talk regularly over the course of the rest of this year, although some other positives to take away from it. So let's get into it. Knight is going to get my player of the series. It's become completely unfair for Satab ever since Knight decided to lock in. The worst thing Satab ever did was beat Knight in a best of 5 and kind of outplay him at least a little bit in the first time that they played, you know, look okay in that matchup. Knight took that personally, and I think you can see that with how he has played against Satab over the course of the rest of this year. He has decimated him every other time that they played against each other. Go look at that playoff series that they played in winter. Go look at the first time these two teams met in the Group Ascend round robin. It's just been diabolical what Knight has been doing to Satab over and over again, mostly in this series on the Sylas. In game number 1, I think that was the main one that stood out to me, but it's not like the Yone game wasn't super brutal as well. It's just Satab was more susceptible on the Azir than he was on the Ahri, so it was a little bit more noticeable, but Knight is absolutely back in his form. I'm not saying that this guy is going to be an MVP frontrunner or anything, but I do think he's in the conversation for MVP, or certainly working his way back up to it with BLG's resurgence coming through. I think that there's going to be a lot of eyes on this team now, and I think Knight is going to be the player that most people see first, and that is correct. Like, that is objectively the right thing to see right now. Knight is the guy for BLG. I think Bin as well, though, is the other player you really have to to point out in a majorly positive way. I am going to preface this entire segment by saying, okay, Hoya's probably the worst top laner in the entire league. He's certainly up there at the very least. There are multiple players that can make an argument in that direction, but Hoya might be leading all of them, especially with lane swaps gone now. There's absolutely no way to protect him. He's an awful laner. He's a really bad team fighter. He's just not an LPL caliber player, and that's kind of the preface that you need to go into this, but Bin massacred him in lane and really took over, especially on the Yorick in game number 2, where he was Yorick. He was a split push monster. He was able to take over the entire map, do everything that you could want out of a top laner, you know, playing for BLG. And Bin has been pretty out of form so far in 2025. He's really not been all that good, especially in comparison to his own personal, like, expectations and achievements that he's put out in the past. We've seen this before from Bin in the regular seasons, you know, back in 2020, 2021. This guy was going to Worlds Finals and, you know, really kind of making a name for himself as one of the best top laners in the world, and would still just kind of randomly not be good every regular season because he saved all of his mojo for playoffs. Maybe that's going to be the case once again, but it's nice to see that form at least still exists. Beishwan continues to look like a massive upgrade for BLG, not necessarily just because of the plays that he's making, but because of the play style that he's employing for this team. We've seen things like Sejuani really work out for him over the course of previous series. Skarner really work out for him. This time it's Pantheon and Lilia. These are some more aggressive, more, I would say, selfish-oriented champions, and yet he's still able to generate a ton of pressure for his solo laners in that regard. It's really impressive stuff. Elkanon were fine as well. BLG just looked way better than ThunderTalk. Not that that should be a surprise, but this team is genuinely back. I don't think there's any ifs, ands, or buts about it anymore. And then for ThunderTalk on the other side, it's one of the jungle mid duo, or Hoya. I guess it's one of the top side that has to get dead of the series here. I'm giving it to Xiao Huangren in the jungle just because I think he was probably the player that ended up playing the worst. I think Satab has a really nice argument because he got absolutely obliterated by Knight, as he basically always has ever since that first series where these two met earlier on this year. Hoya, like I said, stood no chance against Bin, and the Cho'Gath in particular looked completely inept in game number 2, but to me, losing all pressure in the jungle, especially because ThunderTalk at the end of the day had to make this move. It's not like Bilibili came calling for Beishwan, and ThunderTalk was like, well, I guess you're forcing us to give up our jungler. ThunderTalk had to be like, yeah, we will trade you or sell you or whatever you want to say. We will give you our jungler because we feel like we have somebody else that we can put into that role. And to see him come in and just be so much worse than the person that he came in and, you know, replaced is just an absolute disaster. This is not a tip of the cap moment. I feel really bad about saying this, but I've been pushing back on the Xiao Huangren hype for a very, very long time. I can remember back to last year when every single comment on a ThunderTalk game was, why is Beishwan still in? Where is Xiao Huangren? Why is Xiao Huangren not starting over Beishwan? Here you go, man. He's never been better than Beishwan. He has never been the better jungler, and I think that's become abundantly clear. Maybe he gets there, but honestly, he spent so much time in developmental, and he's never gotten better. He's never grown out of what he was as an initial prospect like 5 years ago, that I just don't believe this guy is ever going to be an LPL caliber jungler, or at least a good LPL caliber jungler. That being said, like again, when Satab and Hoya get destroyed in the way that they did, maybe it's not entirely on jungle. I just think the entire top side of ThunderTalk ended up letting the team down. Feather wasn't very good, especially on Seraphine in game 1. 1xN was fine, but didn't really get to do anything throughout this series. ThunderTalk just isn't nearly as good as BLG, and quite frankly, they're not as good as anybody else in Group Ascent. They've been the number 10 team in the power rankings for a little bit, and they continue to look like that, especially with their new jungle. And then for Bilibili, this team is back. I'm not going to say they're entirely back. I still need to see them face some top-tier competition, but Knight and Bin feel so much more comfortable. Beishwan feels like he's unlocked a lot of the solo laners again, and that's going to be the difference between a good BLG team and a great BLG team. Then moving on now to day number 2, and we kick day 2 off with the matchup between JD Gaming and Team WE, where JDG is going to pick up the 2-1 series win. Unfortunately for WE, their hot streak not quite enough to carry them through to a victory against JD Gaming, but it certainly wasn't a bad series from them at all. A good performance overall, and honestly a couple of really great performances from some individual players, but, you know, kind of similar to their series against FPX, just as a package, it's not enough to get them over the top of a team that is just a little bit better than they are, and that is JD Gaming, who very clearly had the best player on the Rift. When we talked about WE earlier on day number 1, we talked about Monkey being so crucial and integral towards their success. Well, for JDG, it was unfortunately their jungler that ended up being the one to get gigantic leads in this series, specifically in game number 3 on the Kindred. We know Shun's kind of known for Kindred. We know this is the pick that a lot of people associate with them. Maybe not the pick, right? Because Nidalee is right up there as well, but Nidalee, Kindred, they're the two picks for this player, and they always have been, going back to his time on Invictus Gaming, and then obviously Bilibili, and now on JD Gaming. It's always been what they've been looking for, but some people sometimes forget just how good he is at Kindred, and let's not get it, out of control here. Kindred is not particularly strong or meta right now. I don't think Kindred is particularly useful in the jungle, but it just doesn't really matter if you're going to pilot the champion at this high of a level. If you get fed on a champion like Kindred, you absolutely can still take over the game. So credit to Shun. I thought he played really excellent here in game 3, and it's not like he was worse in game number 1. He was absolutely, without a doubt, the best player on the Rift today for JD Gaming. I don't even think that there is any argument for any other player, and very quietly, he's been having a pretty great spring split. Him and Paze are a dynamic duo that make it very difficult to overcome JDG. They're kind of a barrier right now. It's funny because in terms of what they are to the league, I'm going to compare them to a team that they are obviously way better than and have a ton of talent, over, but I think they are to the LPL what Movistar Koi right now is to the LEC, where it feels like they are consistently better than the average teams, are just going to be able to dominate them, but I have some questions and concerns about the way that they win and whether or not that's going to be enough to actually be able to compete at the top of the LPL, and unfortunately, this doesn't necessarily quiet any of those rumors. We know that Shun is really good, and quite frankly, the other player who played really well in this series was Paze down in the bot lane, who's been the best AD carry in the LPL so far this year, and again, I don't even think that is all that arguable. I really do think he's been that good for this team. He's super consistent as a team fighter, and even with Taiyun really popping off on the other side for WE, maybe even having a better series here than he did earlier on in the week, Paze is still incredible, and you still have to give him a lot of shouts, but for JD Gaming, their problems continue to persist, and that's the fact that the rest of this roster just isn't particularly consistent. Now, at least Scout has, fantastic games. At least you can get on the idea that Scout, on any given day can pop off and really carry from the mid lane spot, but Ala in the top lane, missing in the support position, they've just not been good players. They've been near bottom of their own role in Group Ascent in terms of their actual production, and while Ala was better than his counterpart Cube on the other side here, especially in that third and final game, and missing wasn't awful in this series, the big concern is always just, are they going to be good enough to be able to compete with the upper echelon of teams? So far, the answer to that has been no, but at least they're still able to get the job done against teams like WE, who are good. I don't want it to seem like WE is some sort of awful team that has nothing going for them, but WE is not a team that should be competing with a team like JD Gaming, especially on paper, and especially when Monkey is not the better jungler. We talked about this pretty extensively in the first series, but he is so integral to what WE wants to do in terms of their prio and pressure that even when, the rest of the team ends up doing fine, Taiyun was pretty good here. I think that there were some moments where Vampire and Karis ended up looking positive. Karis had a great game in game 2, but was overall pretty useless outside of that, and Taiyun was super consistent throughout the entire series, but specifically on that Kaisa in game number 3 where he tried his best to keep things alive for WE. Even with those things happening, if JDG have a jungler on their side that's creating just as much, if not more pressure like Shun did, and if they have an AD carry who is doing a little bit more, I guess in terms of consistency in Paze than Taiyun did on the other side, then it just doesn't matter. WE is just a little bit outskilled in that department, but I don't want to criticize the entire, function of this team. I think they kind of played fine. The only real major concern I have is Cube in the top lane, who just did not look good on Cassante in game number 3. We're seeing Cassante make a slight comeback, and I'm really not sure why this champion has been nerfed into the ground. His stats are just really bad right now, and that's why Mbessa has risen in popularity so much. He's basically Cassante, except with better stats, and, overall, obviously, her kit is just a tad bit better, but Cassante has been nerfed over and over and over again to the point where he's just not pro-ready anymore, and he was super useless in game number 3. It really was the only game where I felt like one player was entirely non-functional, and unfortunately that's enough in a series like this for Cube when most things were back and forth, but it was fine for WE. Again, I'm not trying to be critical of them. I think this is the expected outcome. They took a game off of JD Gaming, which is already a pretty big positive, and, you can talk about game 3 being pretty up in the air. I think they're going to be happy with this result even if they lost it, and JDG is going to be fine picking up a win. Really, at this point, they're just trying to guarantee that they can get into top 4 and qualify for playoffs immediately without going through a best of 5. I think it's pretty likely that they end up doing so, but with a potential Bilibili resurgence, Weibo still staying relatively hot, even if they're not quite as hot as they were a couple of weeks ago, maybe even a team like Invictus going on a big, late season run. There are a lot of other teams that are going to be pushing, and so every win counts for JD Gaming, and this one is, a part of that as well. Then moving on to our second series of day number 2, and again, a predictable result and maybe more clean than we expected. Invictus Gaming taking on Thunder Talk once again. Thunder Talk is going to drop another series. Invictus will pick up one of their first wins in a little while, especially against a team that they actually should be able to beat. One of the problems with Invictus is just the lack of consistency, but you know what? It was pretty good throughout this series. Now, not everything was fantastic. I think you can definitely point to game number 2 and the Shy just deciding to run it down, even though he's going into Hoya, who's not been able to beat anybody, and the rest of this team not exactly stepping up in that instance. But games 1 and 3, pretty great overall for Invictus. Not really a lot to complain about. Very dominant and honestly very clean, all things considered. For Thunder Talk, it's just clear that they are the worst team in Group Ascend. I don't even think I really have to explain that right now. Pretty much any wins that they get from this point onwards, I'm going to likely chalk up to the enemy team just kind of throwing against them, because this team has proven that while they have some talent and can do some things on any given day, they don't have a full package. Like, they just do not have like an entire breadth of skill sets. I think losing Beishuan has legitimately eliminated everything that this team can possibly do to win games, and that's not to say he was the only good player or anything like that, just that I don't think they have any sort of identity. They certainly don't have any sort of consistency at all, and it's really coming back to bite them. So let's go ahead and get into this for Invictus Gaming. Gala is going to get my player of the game here for IG. Didn't really have to think about this all that much. Player of the series was a pretty easy call. He's mostly getting player of the game, I should say, for game number 3. That's really kind of the main game that he's getting this for. It's not like he was bad in game number 1, though. It was just kind of between him and the Shy in terms of how things went. The Shy gets a pentakill in game number 1 on Mbessa, which is definitely worth a point out, but the Shy was also very bad in game number 2 on the Shen, so that kind of disqualified him for me. Gala was incredible in game 3 on the Lucian, completely gapped his opponent. And 1xN on the other side, like really gapped his opponent, which we will talk about as we go throughout, because that doesn't show up in the scoreline. But Gala was incredible, ended up playing all these fights really well. And you know what? Maybe what this bot lane really needed, what Gala and Mako needed to get on the same page, was just to start playing a lot of these 2v2 dominant lanes and just start to win early. If that's going to be the case and that's what they want to do, then sure, man, index into that. I'm certainly not going to be the one to push against it all that much. I think that there is definitely a lot to take away there, because Mako was also pretty good in this series. And you know what? That's not really something we've been saying all that much over the course of this year. Mako has been one of the least valuable players in the entirety of the LPL, regardless of role, regardless of, Group Ascend, Group Nirvana. Like, Mako's lost so many games for Invictus over the course of this split with his lack of consistency. It's really nice to see him just genuinely have a good series from start to finish, and especially again in game 3 on that Nami look incredibly solid. To me, it was clear Gala and Mako were the two most consistent players. You still have to shout out the Shy for that game 1 on Mbessa, and he was pretty good in game 3 on the Gwen as well, but again, kind of disqualified from player of the series when you're as bad as he was in their loss. Jeje continues to be awesome, although Xiao Huangren has obviously shown not to be a particularly big piece of competition on the other side. That being said, nice Lilia game from him in game 2, and Jeje didn't really have a real answer to that, but Nefiri, Poppy, it all looked solid. Rookie has gotten a lot more comfortable ever since he started playing old champions again, and stopped trying to play a lot of the new champions outside of Talia, I guess, which isn't even really a new champion or anything like that, but no more Aurora, no more, Yone, no more of that stuff. Like, play the stuff he was playing back in 2017, 2018 when he was winning Worlds. That's what's been working for him. Azir, Orianna, Galio, that kind of stuff has definitely been clicking a lot more for him than what he played at the beginning of the year. But overall, just a pretty clean series win for Invictus. They don't get these much, so it's exciting when they do. And then for Thunder Talk, this team, I've already said it, is just kind of bad. There are a couple of moments you can take away from this. Game 2 was honestly pretty fine from them, all things considered. The Lilia got super fed. Xiao Huangren did a great job of being able to pressure tempo out of that second game, and I do think he absolutely deserved that player of the game. Outside of that, he wasn't particularly good. Maybe they just want to start playing for him to be a bit more of a carry. Maybe that's what it is. We've seen a couple of facilitative type of games from Xiao Huangren, and it's not necessarily worked, so we'll see if they want to switch up strategies there. Satab was predictably pretty feast or famine when he was picking a lot more of these aggressive picks, but I do think it's the right idea to go for some of these more aggressive picks if you want to go for them. Things like the Aurora in game number 2 that worked out a bit better just in terms of the play style of Satab. He's definitely more of an assassin player, and as much as you don't want a player who struggles as much as he does individually 1v1 to have that much responsibility, if it's going to salvage some of his individual performances, I think it's definitely worth it. Hoya played tanks the entire time except for game number 1. He looked better on the tanks than he did on the Rumble Rumble where he got mega abused regardless of how strong that champ is. And then maybe to the shock of a lot of people, 1xN is actually going to be my dud of the series. I know I get a bit of a reputation for being a 1xN hater on this channel. 1xN and Assume both definitely get some hating credentials from me throughout a lot of these games and really throughout the past couple of years, but I just can't really look at game number 3 and see anything other than Gala completely outplaying 1xN on the other side, who just didn't do anything throughout the entire game. Now, you can blame that on the draft and around the setup or whatever, right? But 1xN was not a player. In game number 3, it was legitimately a 4v5 for Thunder Talk, and that's just not really acceptable. Feather was even fine on that side with the Nico, some really nice pop blossoms to set things up, but there was no follow through, and the Ezreal was completely non-existent. So 1xN's going to get done of the series. I think if you wanted to give it to Hoya for the back half of the series, or I guess for game number 1 mostly, you can do that, but I don't think anybody was particularly awful, and 1xN probably had the weakest game in my eyes in this series, so it ends up going to him. But Thunder Talk is Thunder Talk, right? They're number 10, they're the last team in Group Ascend. Nothing changed from the previous series to now, but this is a nice win for Invictus. It shows that they can win clean and actually be able to carry some momentum over, and hopefully they've started to figure out a strategy they can go to, because they just need to find the ability to win regularly. It's not about their good games, it's about the bad ones, and this was a good one, which is really nice to see. Then moving on now to day number 3, and this is going to be our first series of the week that I commentated. Again, it's going to be a bit of a shorter analysis. If you want to see my live thoughts, go ahead and check out the VOD. Link to that will be in the description, but it was Ninjas in Pyjamas taking on Weibo Gaming, and NIP is going to pick up the 2-0 win here. They're going to sweep Weibo Gaming, which I don't think a lot of people expected coming into this series. I think Weibo had been a little bit white hot as of late, but their loss to BLG at the end of the previous week was definitely a bit of an eye-opener in the sense that, okay, well, this team is already inherently volatile, and there's a lot kind of going on with them. Are they going to be able to keep the swarm up every single time it feels like this team is destined to be top 4 or like upper there in that echelon? They end up crashing back down, and that's kind of what happened here. Ninjas in Pyjamas really only beat teams that are near the top of the standings. It's 2 wins now over Invictus and 1 over Weibo Gaming. Those are their 3 series wins so far in the LPL, and it's just really funny to kind of talk about that, because I do think this team is better right now than they have been for a majority of this split, especially with Solo Kill coming into the top lane, who I think has been a big upgrade for them, but they still have their own little individual flaws that they're able to overcome on a game-to-game basis to pick up wins. So let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the series is very easy. It's going to go to Leave in the bot lane. I think you could theoretically consider someone like Solo Kill on the top side for this, because he was way better than Breathe was on the other side of this matchup, but Leave really was the guy for Ninjas in Pyjamas, especially when it really mattered in game number 2 when he was able to take over on Zeri. I'm a big proponent of these hyper carries right now in the meta. I think it's actually a pretty unexplored win condition that teams just aren't going for. I know it's not the flashiest way to play the game, but I do think it's pretty efficient at the current moment, and Leave definitely kind of showcasing that on the Zeri. A lot of setup and even early game pressure coming in from Aki and Solo Kill, and, you know, a lot of the top side of the map that allows a lot of space for Victor and Zeri to be able to get online, and once they do, it becomes a pretty easy game to win front to back. But Leave definitely took over these team fights. When he's playing well, it looks incredible. There's really not a lot else to talk about in that front. When everything is clicking and working for Leave, things, you know, are gorgeous. His mechanics are insane, and he's able to dominate team fights. When they're not working, he dies every single game at 20 minutes, no matter what game state he's in. No matter how fed or how not fed he is, he's always running it down at about 20 minutes into the game. And so you just gotta hope that you roll right on Leave every day. It does feel like the vibes are a bit better when it comes to Ninjas in Pyjamas, a team that very much relies on vibes in order to feel pretty good about their plays, and Leave definitely operates better in that kind of environment. He had a good game on the Varus in game 1, but an even better one on that Zeri in game 2. Again, I mean, you got to consider Solo Kill for player of the series, because he did pretty mega gap Breathe, and I think specifically that Scion game was very valuable in game number 1. You've got Doingby, who I think is playing pretty well right now in the mid lane, definitely feels a lot more comfortable. It's been kind of rumored and talked about that Doingby did not like playing with Shanji on the top side, and if that's going to be the case with Solo Kill coming in, hopefully he feels better about that situation. I know everybody wants to shit on Aki, and trust me, I don't think he was perfect here, and, you know, I've done my own kind of negative criticisms of Aki, but I do think he's kind of turning into insert jungle scapegoat for a team that's underperforming in the LPL that we kind of talk about every single year. Like, there's one every single year. Last year it was Beishwan for Thunder Talk when people thought they would do better. You know, for 2023 it was Tarzan on LMG, who everybody just kind of expected to do better. I think you can see the trend. I'm not saying that Aki is on the level of those players, but, you know, oftentimes a lot of these, you know, junglers that end up getting getting scapegoated for their team's weaknesses end up being a little bit more, I'm not going to say victims in their circumstance, but, definitely aren't the entire story. And I don't know if that's going to be the case for Aki. He's making some individual massive errors, but at the end of the day, Ninjas in Pyjamas are starting to get into form, and they continue their trend of just upsetting good teams and, more inconsistently good teams here in the LPL. And for Weibo, it's just a frustrating series for them to end up dropping. Breathe is going to get my dud of the series because he got pretty mega outplayed on the top side of the map. The Shen has really risen in popularity a lot, as we've already seen throughout the week in the top lane, but the Ornn was really bad in game number 1. If you're going to fight tank with tank on the top side, you have to be useful in, like, pressing your ultimate in team fights, and it didn't really feel like Breathe was ever going for that. I didn't really notice one gigantic Ornn ult throughout this entire game, and that's just a disaster. Like, there's no way to justify that, and that's even with Tion playing pretty active. I think Tion's in better form right now than he has been basically at any point throughout 2025, and even with that, the team doesn't seem to be able to click. Xiaohu had one of his weaker series in a while. Doingbe was better in the mid lane. Erha, I think, had one of his weaker series ever since being inserted as the starting support for Weibo, so just not really their best effort, and especially with Bilibili kind of re-emerging as an upper tier threat and feeling a lot more complete with Beishwan in the jungle now, it feels pretty clear to me that Weibo's kind of been knocked out of that top 4 in terms of expectations. They are likely going to have to play a best of 5 in order to get into the playoffs, but as long as they can keep their trajectory up and not throw too many series like this, hopefully that will be against a Group Nirvana team for their own sanity. But just think of the memes if Weibo plays a Group Nirvana team and loses. That is definitely something that would be funny, but for now, I'm not panicking over a Weibo loss. They happen all the time, and I'm certainly not freaking out over a Ninjas in Pyjamas win. It's nice to see this team playing well, and they are definitely better than they have been previously because of solo kill on the top side, but they are inherently flippy because of the way that their roster is constructed. I need to see more than just one win against a Weibo gaming team that can lose anything in order to feel like NIP is definitely going to be a team near like the middle top of the standings, like closer to 5 or 6. Then moving on to our second series of day number 3, and it's a real test for a top of the table team to prove their changes were real, and they passed that test with flying colors. It was Anyone's Legend taking on Bilibili Gaming, and BLG picks up the 2-0 win over a team that I think a lot of people are considering favorites to win the LPL right now. Is that where BLG are at after this one small, simple change? Has this one thing of taking away Wei and putting Beishwan in taken BLG from, a top 5, top 6 team to a top 1 team in the LPL? I don't think it's crazy to assume that that's the case. Remember, this team ran the LPL last year with Bin, Knight, Elk, and On. They just have not been able to figure out that jungle position. Shun obviously going to have a lot of success on JD Gaming. Wei was just not getting it done this year. He was not playing particularly well himself. His style just hasn't aged particularly well in terms of how League has evolved. And you know what? Beishwan coming in has really reignited this team. And as much as I'd love to sit here and say that it's everybody, like Knight is popping off and Knight's playing like an MVP again, and that's really what matters. And Bim is starting to feel more comfortable. Elk had his best series in a very long time in this one. He was awesome in Game 2 on the Ezreal. I actually do think it's Beishwan who is stepping in and really stepping up for BLG. He's going to get player of the series for me, mostly for that Xin Zhao game in Game number 2, and the reason that that's so interesting is because in his first couple of series that he played with BLG, the Xin Zhao was the problem. He was playing Xin Zhao, Skarner, and Sejuani repeatedly in these 3-game sets, and then always losing the Xin Zhao game, and so for him to come in and actually show that he can dominate Tarzan on Xin Zhao is ridiculously impressive, because let's be real, there was a jungle gap in this series. Beishwan was just straight up better than Tarzan on the other side, and I don't even think it's really all that debatable that, Tarzan got gapped here. This is ridiculous stuff from Beishwan. I'm the biggest Tarzan defender in the world, but Beishwan has also been a channel darling in the past, and for him to just show up like he has been so far for BLG and completely reinvigorate this team and the way that they play the game, it's really, really awesome and fun to watch. Of course, you still got to shout out Knight. Like, I would be remiss not to mention that this guy, ever since Beishwan came into the jungle, has probably been the best player in the LPL. Like, he has reclaimed that throne in terms of how he's been able to play the game. Yone, Talia in this one, 2 very different styles, but still both work for Knight. I don't know what it was with him and Wei, but they just did not get along chemistry-wise. They barely played for each other at all. Wei was very resource-heavy in terms of trying to get resources for himself, and Knight really didn't thrive under the idea that he was just going to be playing 1v1 the entire game. Like, as much as I compare Knight and Chovy in terms of the times that they came up and the effects that they've had on their individual regions, and the fact that I think both of them have pretty clearly been the best players in their regions over the past couple of years, they're not the same in terms of play styles. Chovy is happy to farm up 1v1 and take over in the late game. That's not really who Knight is as a player. He wants to get out with his jungler on the map and, make plays, and that's what Beishwan is kind of allowing him to do more so than what Wei was capable of doing with him, and Knight is really unlocked once again for it. If he had done this a couple of weeks earlier, again, he'd be a big favorite for MVP, as it is right now, he's just a phenomenal player. Elk had his best series in a very long time. He's really not been all that good in 2025. I shouldn't say that. He's been, like a league average to slightly above league average AD carry, which is just not good enough for Elk, who was coming off of what I considered to be the best AD carry in the world last year, like in terms of just raw production. He has not been anywhere close to that in 2025. Nice to see him get back into form. On was good. Bin has continued to be much better, even if he still is dying in side lanes. Like, BLG just looks so much more complete. And I'm not trying to sit here and say that, Beishuan is the only thing, but it really is the only major change. Some people are talking as if Maokai is no longer the head coach of this team. He absolutely is. He is still on this team. He's still the head coach. Don't really know why people are sitting there being like, Maokai gone, team got better. Like, he is still drafting for them every single game. I have no clue what people are talking about in that regard, but Beishuan has been the gigantic major addition for BLG, and he continues to look great. And then for anyone's legend on the other side, coming off of one of their biggest wins of the entire year, a strong victory over Top Esports, a demon that they had, kind of failed to conquer in recent series. They immediately dropped to Bilibili Gaming, and they do so in concerning fashion. Tarzan mega outplayed in this series. Easy choice for dead of the series. I don't even really know what to say. I haven't seen Tarzan get outplayed like this in a very, very long time. It's probably been since LNG, like Tarzan, that it's been this bad. Maybe there were a couple of games or series on Weibo last year that I'm just forgetting, but this was a really bad performance from him, and, he can have these every once in a while because he is a skirmisher and somebody who likes to be aggressive. When things go really wrong on that front, it can get a bit out of control for him. It just so rarely ends up going wrong for Tarzan, and so it was a bit shocking, a bit surprising, but, credit to Beishuan for being able to take advantage of him. Tarzan, we'll see if he's going to be able to bounce back in the series later this week. Shanks also pretty mega outplayed by Knight. There's a pretty major talent gap between these two. I like Shanks, but Knight on a, Knight when he's comfortable is on a completely different level, and I think that's what we saw. KO in the bot lane was just fine. Like, On was definitely much more proactive, but not much you can do on Nami. Hope wasn't really able to carry games. In fact, his positioning was quite bad in the back half of some of these games, and Flandra wasn't really super consistent. AL just didn't feel like they were nearly as good as BLG, and some of these games were at least kind of interesting. Hope had a bit of gold. Shanks had a bit of gold in some of these games, but really, I never expected them to be able to win any of these fights, and they couldn't. BLG were better. They had more tempo. They played a little bit cleaner, and I think most of the resources that they gave over were from stupid, dumb plays from either Bin or Beishuan just being a little bit too far forward, but for the most part, you're still looking at a really clean series, and this BLG team has looked unstoppable ever since Beishuan has come in. Genuinely, are we looking at the best team in the league? Because that's what this result kind of says. Then moving on now to day number 4, and we kick day 4 off with the matchup between Thunder Talk Gaming and FunPlus Phoenix, and FPX is going to pick up the 2-0 series win. Thunder Talk once again falling early on in a series, and just continuing their cascading slide down the standings in Group Ascend. This is clearly the worst team right now in Group Ascend. They can't buy a win against anybody. Ever since losing Beishuan, this team is just awful, and obviously we know the reason why. We know they just don't have enough talent to be able to overcome it, and even Reddit, I think at this point, is starting to understand that, even though they simp for a lot of these players a lot more than I do, and we'll talk about it. There are some players that are being considered ELO held on this team that I just don't necessarily agree with, but Thunder Talk is not very good, and FunPlus Phoenix, they're fine. They're not a great team. They're not an unbelievable team. We saw that earlier in the week, but they're certainly good enough to be able to pick up wins against teams that are not good, and that's what Thunder Talk was here today, and that's what they've been recently. So this will probably be a relatively quick discussion. I almost always say that, and it almost never is, but, these are two teams we've already talked about this week, not really a ton new to add to them. Jway is going to get player of the series for me. He's gotten so many of these for FPX over the course of this split. Almost every single one of their wins you can attribute to one of Jway, Shadow, or I guess earlier in the split, Sheer. Sheer's definitely taken much more of a background role in recent weeks, but he was awesome in this series. We're going to talk about that. Again, giant caveat, he's going into Hoya, who just cannot play at the LPL level, but Jway continues to be the primary playmaker, the primary facilitator, and the best player on FPX. He's really climbing up those player of the game leaderboards, the MVP leaderboards as they are in the LPL. It's been really fun to watch his breakout over the course of 2025 because it was previewed in 2024. This is a player who had a great spring split, really looked like he was piecing some things together, ended up switching teams, going from one bad team to another at the end of 2024, from Ultra Prime to Rare Atom, and, not necessarily finding his groove in that regard, but getting a shot here on FPX and really showing that a lot of of that positivity that he showed at the beginning of 2024 was a prelude to what he could be in 2025, and it's not like this roster is intently better than what he had last year on Ultra Prime. It's about the same in terms of quality. The only major difference is that Jway, I think, is getting better and better. I wouldn't be surprised to see him on a top-tier team in the next few years. Maybe FPX ends up becoming a top-tier team. I don't know if this org has the cash to go out and spend on those kinds of players anymore, as former world champions, but Jway definitely deserves to be fighting over a top 4 placement rather than, fighting just to get a top 8-ish placement like he is right now. I do also want to shout out Care. I think this is one of his better series in a while. Satab will do that. On the other side, the Talia, the Corki, both of them looking solid. Satab playing a lot more passive, pulling out the Orianna in particular in game number 2, basically the exact opposite of everything that Satab has found success on over the course of this year. I have no idea what the possible thought process was in that draft. I get that, generally speaking, Ori is kind of undervalued right now because control mages are undervalued, but, Satab is not good at them, and so why would you let him pick them? Like, Care absolutely decimated this, and he played Corki, and he still got an early lead. It's just diabolical. Sheer ends up going 8-2 and 24 across these 2 games. Some awesome performances on both the Gwen and the Scion. Somehow, some way, I think he's becoming a bit underrated by the LPL community. This guy was 1 game away from going to Worlds for a reason last year. Shadow is incredible, and Xiao Huangren had no chance to be able to go up against him. Of course, he's going to look bad against good junglers that can, take advantage of some of his mechanical flaws, but he's a very talented player, and, as much as I, shit on Assume on this channel and kind of, say that he's a little overrated, it's funny. 1xN and Assume are kind of the 2 players that I've always talked about being a bit overhyped by the LPL community. He's certainly been fine across this week. He was really good in their first series and was more than good enough to win with in this series. So credit to FPX. Again, they're good. They're just maybe not unbelievable, and Thunder Talk is bad. And so that ends up being kind of the way that things work out. This could be a bottom, 3 or 4 team in the LPL, and I really wouldn't be all that shocked. I think especially once they lost Beishuan, like this is no longer a Group Ascend type of roster, and, maybe they end up proving me wrong and pulling off some upsets down the stretch, but at least at the start of this week, the 0 and 3 is definitely indicative of just where they're at in terms of their skill level. Xiao Huangren is once again going to get dud of the series. This guy's been nothing but a negative since coming in. You can point out that game 2 earlier in the week, and that Lilia game, like it's just, oh yeah, there's something in there. I'm sorry, there's nothing in here. I've never been a fan of Xiao Huangren. I've actually pushed really back on the hype in the LDL because his LDL tape is quite bad, if we're being entirely honest, and there's been no sign of progression. He has not been getting better in the 5 years that he's been in this system. He's finally being given an opportunity, and lo and behold, that lack of development has shown itself to be a problem at the LPL level. It doesn't help that he has horrible solo laners. Hoya and Satab are both pretty unplayable. Hoya's just really bad in lane, and Sheer took advantage of that, and Satab, was playing Orianna, and he's miserable at control mages, and so you just live with that. Reddit's gonna try and tell you that 1xN is elo held on this team. I just don't believe that, and the reason is not because I think that 1xN or even Assume are, like, bad players. I've said this for a while. I just think that the LPL AD carry, like, margin of error is just way too freaking high. Like, you're telling me these guys are better than, I don't know, let's pick Leave or Gala. Like, those are the players you have to be better than to be a little bit higher. Light on Weibo Gaming. Those are the teams that are around FPX level in the standings. You're telling me that 1xN is elo held because he's not getting an opportunity on a team like those players are? Those players are way better than 1xN, and they're way better than Assume, but, people will continue to tell you that 1xN is elo held and should be on a spot above those players. I just don't really understand it. Feather had one of his weaker series in a while, but again, Jway just kind of outplays everybody. So overall, it is what it is for Thunder Talk. This team is bad, and it doesn't really show any signs of improvement. And then FPX on the other side, they're fine. They're a good team. They're certainly not going to get got by a team like Thunder Talk who doesn't have the talent to go into them. I just don't really think they have a ridiculous amount of upside. They're going to do just fine. They'll probably be a team that competes to make it into playoffs, but I don't think they're going to do much better than potentially getting top 8. Then moving on to our second series of day number 4, and a kind of predictable result in the end, but a very strange way to get there. It was Top Esports taking on Ninjas in Pyjamas, and yes, Top Esports is going to pick up the win, as we all kind of anticipated in this series, but they dropped game number 2 in 42 minutes to NIP, which is certainly not what I had on my bingo card, and once again, it's the same members of NIP stepping up, and it's not the ones you would have predicted mid-season, even really pre-season, right? It's Solo Kill coming into the top lane looking great. It's Leave carrying games on Lucian in the bot lane. All of that is fantastic, but unfortunately, it's just not quite enough to drag the ghosts of Aki, Doingbi, and PP God across the finish line, who just have not been here all split long. I mean, Doingbi at some points has been here, but Aki and PP God have looked awful. Top Esports, are good enough to be able to capitalize on that, and there's certainly a lot to talk about here, and that really starts with the solo lanes, in my opinion. Whoever you want to give player of the series to, I think is up to you. I think Cream was more consistent throughout this series in terms of the plays he made. He didn't really make a lot of negative plays. That Yone game in Game 3, absolutely gorgeous, but I do think that 369 was just a little bit more standoutish in terms of the plays he made for me, mostly on the Rumble in Game number 1, which to me was the best game of the series from any one player, maybe with the exception of Leave in Game number 2 on the other side, but he was still good on Gwen in Game 3, and even if he was really aggressive on Renekton in Game 2, he was like the only source of income that team had throughout a majority of that game, so 369 is getting player of the series for me. Again, I thought he played really well, even with solo kill being really aggressive on the other side. He pulls out the Akali in Game 3, it's answered with the Gwen, or the Gwen is being answered by the Akali on the other side, and 369 still, I think, plays out that game totally fine, even if Game 3 was probably the least impressive of the three, so credit to him, he's been awesome all year. The best top laner in the LPL, and I don't even think it's really all that close, but Cream definitely deserves player of the series as well. Coming out of the mid lane, again, he was probably more stable across this series. I just don't know if he was quite as eye-catching in terms of the plays he made. Some of them in Game number 3, absolutely deserving of that phrase, eye-catching, because the Yone looked gorgeous, and those melee mids are definitely kind of his forte, but, the Talia in Game 1, pretty solid. The Azir in Game 2, certainly not the problem in that game. So I just think Cream was very solid, very stable, very good across this series. You can look at all 3 games and, feel good. If you wanted to give him player of the series for that, I think that's fair, especially because Doingby was so bad on the other side, but I think that's more of a personal preference. It's up to you. Jackie Love was super greedy. So was Kanavi throughout a lot of this series. Sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't, but I'd rather see Jackie Love playing aggressive than Jackie Love playing passive. That's more so when I get concerned, and I think Crisp also had a pretty good series, all things considered. Top Esports was pretty good here. Certainly not super upset by their victory. A lot of things they could clean up because they're Top Esports and they're very greedy as a team naturally. It's why they end up failing against teams that are a little bit more mechanically talented and can actually go toe-to-toe with some of their skirmishes, but, it's fine. At the end of the day, they're able to take down the teams they need to beat right now. It's all about the playoffs for them. And then for Ninjas in Pyjamas on the other side, they have their own little set of limitations. It doesn't ever feel like this team is going to be good across the board from a game-to-game basis. Solo kill and Leave were incredible here. Solo kill in particular looks like a ginormous upgrade in the top lane for this team. He has been 100 million times better than what Shanji was, and it's unfortunate for Shanji because he was a player with so much promise in the LPL, even just a couple of years ago, being talked about as a top 3 guy alongside 369 and Bin, and it's just not really been able to last for him. But Solo Kill was a player I was praising on Edward Gaming last year when that team was underperforming, when they couldn't win a game. I thought Solo Kill was one of the only players who actually looked interesting on that team. Very funny to see so many of them actually start to perform with Monkey going over to WE. Of course, Solo Kill and Leave here on Ninjas in Pyjamas. It's really interesting to see the success of that team now, but overall, it's just cool to see Solo Kill get another chance and play well. Leave was awesome in Game 2, but was a little bit of a letdown in the other games. It's just what Leave is as a player. He's very tempo and vibes based, and when it works, it works, and when it doesn't, it doesn't. But really, like Doingby, Aki, PP God, they were all really bad in this series. Doingby's going to get dud of the series for me. I think he was the most consistently bad throughout this, but if you wanted to give it to Aki because that Pantheon game in particular in Game 1 was not very good, I do understand that. If you wanted to give it to PP God because that Leona game in Game 3 was pretty bad, I understand that. I just think Doingby was probably the worst across this series as a whole, and that's been the problem for Ninjas in Pyjamas, is they rely so much on Doingby as a player to be able to generate pressure for them to win lane, mid lane, and that's what they hoped that Solo Kill coming into the top side would fix, but as it would seem, if Doingby loses in the mid lane, he still loses incredibly hard, and there's still a ton of responsibility on him being relevant in these games, which he just hasn't been. If he's getting outplayed by Cream, NIP is not going to be able to compete near the top of the standings, but it's a nice win for Top Esports. You're happy to see them be able to pick it up, but no real surprises here except for the fact that NIP actually played well in Game 2. Then moving on now to day number 5, and we kick day 5 off with probably the biggest upset of the week so far, FunPlus Phoenix taking on Anyone's Legend. And remember how I said FPX can beat anyone so long as they underperform enough on the other side? Well, here you go, a gigantic upset victory for FPX as they pull off the 2-1 series win against the team I moved to number 1 in my power rankings at the end of last week. I'm not saying that that position is cursed, because Top Esports for the most part was pretty good for most of the year sitting at number 1, but AL is probably only going to have 1 week at the top of the power rankings after this result. Honestly, they have not looked good so far this week. I think there's been some takeaways that have been all right, and they were okay in this series. Their losses were much closer than their win was, which I think is generally usually a good sign, but FPX is the team that's walking away with a series victory, and this could be the series that ends up costing AL the number 1 seed coming out of the regular season, which would obviously be a pretty unfortunate outcome, all things considered, for them. But let's talk about FunPlus Phoenix and talk about what they did well in this series to get here in the first place. Player of the series for me pretty much has to go to Jway in the support position. He's just the anchor and the playmaker for this team, regardless of who he's playing. The only loss this series that he takes is on his best champion in Nico, which I think is pretty funny, all things considered, but the Alistair in game number 1 absolutely decimated anyone's legend. A pretty phenomenal game coming in from him there, and I really do think he took over everything that was happening on the map. He was the primary guy for FPX in game number 1, and then the Renata in game number 3. We talk about Kalista Renata potentially falling down in priority, because I think teams are just better at being able to play against it now than maybe they were, a couple of months ago, but you can still have some amazing pop-off performances, especially if that Renata is the one who's going to be able to get a lot of the pressure, get out on the map, and create for herself. It's the Kalista that I think is struggling a little bit more, but Renata can still be that anchor to tie it to the rest of the team, and Jway is just the guy for FPX. I honestly don't even think I really have to explain it at this point. I've gone in so in-depth on Jway in the past. He is a phenomenal playmaker. Like, truly, when I said it earlier that I really hope a top team ends up, looking his way for 2026, I mean it. I think he will end out the year on FPX, and I think there's a very good shot we could see him promoted to an upper tier team in 2026. And then I do want to point out Care in the mid lane. I think this was a very great series from Care. He's had a couple of these over the course of this split where it's like, oh yeah, I forgot. I really liked you a couple of years ago. I really thought you were going to turn into something in the LPL. He hasn't exactly taken that next leap. Again, I've kind of defined him as the league average mid laner, like somebody who's going to be really good in certain situations, really bad in other situations. Mostly it's going to be determined by draft and setup and how many resources he's given by the rest of his team, but when he wins really hard, and he was just better than Shanks in this series, and the concerning trait for me is that Shanks has now had back-to-back bad series, and we're going to talk about that on the other side. That kind of tends to lead into Shanks being a little bit more inconsistent in the back half of a lot of regular seasons, as we've seen in the past, but Care looking awesome here. And then I think Sheer was pretty good. I think Assume was pretty good. I think Shadow was all right. Certainly the better jungler in this series, at least in my opinion, and that's really nice for FPX. Once again, this is the kind of team that certainly has enough firepower to take advantage of mistakes coming in from the other side. I just don't know how much they're going to create on their own, but Jway, certainly the one player on this team that I really do think can create at a high level. And then for anyone's legend on the other side, what a bad week for Tarzan. Like, I know I'm the biggest Tarzan stan in the entire universe. I've multiple times on this channel called him my favorite player in the world. I believe he's one of the players I am the most biased towards in a positive way. That doesn't mean I don't see the bad games. It doesn't mean I don't see the Trundle in game number 3 and how he ended up piloting that. I've already been pretty critical of the Trundle pick this week. If you go earlier on in a couple of these days, I'm certainly not going to stop here, because this series and this game number 3 was awful from him. He lost a ton of tempo early, and what exactly does the Trundle do here? This is specifically like an anti-tank pick that you want to be a bruiser, and like, who are you stealing stats from? Xin Zhao? Camille? Like, what are we really doing here? It just doesn't really make a lot of sense to me, and Trundle really was not effective. And it's not like Tarzan was excellent in game number 1. He was pretty good in game 2, but so was all of anyone's legend. And when you're looking at their losses, to me, it was pretty clear that Tarzan was dead of the series. He was the least valuable player on his team in the games that they ended up falling in. Now, the rest of his team was okay. Shanks wasn't really all that good. Again, he got outplayed by Care for sure, and I would say that Shanks was definitely the second, player in the running for dead of the series. Kale was not really all that great on the bot side. I think that there were some performances that looked incredible, but this was the kind of matchup where I was really salivating going into it. Jway versus Kale, two of the most eye-catching, fun to watch supports in the entire league, maybe the two most productive supports in the entire league right now, and Kale did not step up to the billing. He was worse than Jway was on the other side as a creator. I think those were the ones that were kind of concerning. Hope was just fine. Again, he gets caught out in the mid game sometimes, and it really does frustrate me because he's just a little bit too far forward, but for the most part, he's okay in these games, and Flandra was awesome on the top side. Not only did he carry game number 2 on the Rumble, but that Scion was trying his best to 1v9, actually impenetrable as a tank on the top side, but unfortunately, he just can't do enough on the Scion to be able to carry the game. So AL had some things going for them. Again, the win that they did have in game 2 was easily the most dominant of the entire series, but that's a lot of nothing, right? You don't care about the most dominant win in the series. You wanted to walk away with a win for your record here, and you just aren't able to get it. FPX is going to be able to pick that up, and that puts them right back in the race for a potential top, 5 or 6 seed in the regular season, which, as a reminder, is a group Nirvana matchup going into the best of 5. So nice spot for FPX to be in. They continue to overperform, I think, what a lot of people are expecting them to be, and they might have found, a pretty nice superstar in the support position with Jway. Then moving on to our second series of day number 5, and boy did we get another good one here as we saw Invictus Gaming taking on Team WE, and IG is going to pick up the 2-1 series win. WE grabs that first game, they show a sign of life, and yet they're just not able to hold on to it as they end up falling in the final 2 to drop this series. A pretty back and forth affair for both of these teams, and once again, it's really hard to just look at the KDAs and tell you exactly who ended up playing well and who didn't, because that's just not indicative of where this series ended up going. I think that there are a couple of players on both sides to praise, a couple of players on both sides to lambast in terms of their individual performances, and we'll get into both as we go throughout here. IG barely scraping by once again. They cannot pick up a win clean, but wins are all they're looking for, and that's what they got here. Once again, I'm giving player of the series to Gala in the bot lane. To me, it was very clearly one of the bot lane members that needed to get player of the series here, and both of them were great across all of week number 6. Gala is the one who's going to get the most amount of praise because he is the follow-through, he's the AD carry, and so, you know, all of the setup, it's all good, but it's got to be paid off, and that's exactly what Gala was able to do in this game. We're going to talk about Taiyun on the other side here, 15, 7, and 15. He was not good in the back half of this series on Ezreal, on Lucian. Almost that entire KDA is game 1 on the Kai'Sa, and Gala just pretty mega outplayed him, and I think we're going to talk about a similar thing for Mako and Vampire, of course, 2 players with a bevy of history as, you know, just interconnected parties when it comes to supports, but Gala just needs to be talked about. I don't think we've mentioned Gala enough over the course of this split. There are 2 players on this team that have actually been able to play well so far across all of 2025, or at least all of the spring split here, and they are Jeje in the jungle, and they are Gala in the bot lane. Mako has been awful for this team at times. He's also been, you know, really good for them this week, and so that does cancel it out a bit. Rookie's had his ups and downs, although he's starting to figure it out. The Shy has certainly had his ups and downs, as has been well documented, not only just on this channel, but everywhere in the LPL community. But Gala really kind of sneakily putting together another MVP caliber split here. I'm not going to say that he's winning the award or anything like that, but in terms of how important he is to Invictus' success and how many series I think he's won for them, I think it's pretty underrated just how important he has been. So give him a lot of credit, but also we got to talk about Mako stepping it up here. Really does feel like ever since they started transitioning into playing more for the 2v2 in the bot lane, things have gotten significantly better for Mako. Maybe that's just the avenue that they need to play for. The Rel was good in game 2, but the Lulu in game 3 was exceptionally good. These enchanters are really working for him as a player, and maybe, you know, if that's what he's going to feel most comfortable on at the current moment, just index into that. It's, of course, a fun matchup, Mako and Vampire. Mako leaving Edward Gaming right before the end of the offseason last year, which basically forces a Vampire promotion into the LPL. These guys were, you know, Mako was supposed to be a mentor for Vampire and just ended up not being the case with him going to top esports. So really fun to see these 2 play off against each other. Jeje was fine. I think the Shy looked really good when he looked good and looked really bad when he looked bad, as is the case with the Shy. And Rookie, for the most part, was good in this series, but he was awful in game number 1 on the Rise, which you do just have to live with. But overall for Invictus, you know, a series win is a series win. I'm going to stop being a stickler about whether or not it's clean. You just can't ever expect this team to be clean in a win. And for WE on the other side, you know, again, kind of an expected outcome. Invictus absolutely should be the better team here, but winning game number 1, especially as dominantly as they were able to do that, is an encouraging sign. You know, Taiyun was pretty excellent in that game, but Monkey, I think, is really the player to shout out once again. For WE, he is the heart, the soul, and quite frankly, the hands of this team in terms of how they operate, and even outside the game number 1 that they ended up winning, he was the pressure point in the back half of this series as well. If only he didn't pick Trundle into no tanks. Well, I guess Rel on the other side, but I'm just tired of this Trundle pick. I don't think it's particularly good right now. I'm surprised to see it come back into meta. You know, maybe I'll be proven wrong. Maybe teams figure out how to use it and it looks a lot better moving forward, but I'm pretty sure it's 0-4 so far in this video, and I'm not exactly sure that's going to be getting better. So credit to Monkey for trying on things like Pantheon and looking great on Jarvan, but maybe negatives towards the bot lane. We'll just say that. Vampire's going to get my dud of the series. I think you could realistically give this to Taiyun as well. Both of these 2 were just pretty heavily outplayed by Gala and Mako on the other side, and that's just not acceptable. Again, these 2 have stepped up for the most part over the course of spring. They've both been so much better than they have at any point in their entire careers, individually or together up until this point, which is a really good thing to see. Not sure how sustainable that's going to be going into top tier talent, you know, fighting for a playoff spot and something like that in like a best of 5, but at least for now it looks okay. Unfortunately, in this series, it just wasn't. Vampire's dead of the series, but like I said, you could give it to Taiyun. Both of them kind of failed in, you know, similar ways. I think Vampire had a worse game number 2, and I think Taiyun had a worse game number 3 on the Lucian, but I think, Taiyun was a little bit better in game number 1 on the Kai'Sa, which did lead me towards Vampire being the choice here. Karis is fine. He was actually pretty okay, especially in game 1 on the Taliyah. Cube was a non-factor on the top side. He continues to pick Asante and be entirely useless because that champion is very weak right now, but, WE is who they are. Invictus actually showed up here today in the back half, and while WE made it interesting and dominated game number 1, they're not able to close out the series. It's a nice win for Invictus, and like I said, at this point, I'm way beyond the point of hoping and praying for an Invictus series to actually be ended cleanly. I'm expecting them to drop a game number 1 and then force themselves to come back and be more clinical, but at the very least, they're capable of doing that to walk out of this series with a win. But then moving on now to day number 6, and as a reminder, this is kind of the super week here in the LPL. Instead of one of these final 2 days being, super days with 3 series, we have both of them as super days with 3 series, so 6 left to go over, and starting off day number 6, it's a matchup potentially for the last time between RNG and Edward Gaming. That Edward Gaming is going to pick up the 2-1 series win in. The reason I say potentially for the last time is because RNG already locked themselves out of potential survival for split number 3 for the summer split. Their split is done. Their year is done. Now being a bottom 2 team alongside OMG, they do not get to play in summer. They do not get to play for the rest of the year. And of course, with everything that we know going on with the organization behind the scenes right now, all of the money problems and just not being able to pay players and all of this stuff, I think it's pretty realistic to expect that we maybe never get to see this team play again in the LPL, which is just such a shame. This is one of the most historic organizations in League of Legends history, let alone in LPL history. This is a team that's made World Finals. They've made Worlds regularly up until about 2022 and 2023, like that era. They just haven't been able to recapture that same kind of form, and to see them go out in the way that they have over the past couple of years, it's been entirely disastrous and unfortunate to see. But like I said, this might be the last time that we ever get to see RNG professionally in League of Legends, and Edward Gaming is an apt opponent to be their final matchup. This is one of the most historic rivalries in LPL history, and for this to potentially be their last hurrah, I think makes a lot of sense. So we'll go ahead and talk about the games themselves, because there are some interesting things to talk about, and that's kind of what this channel is about, but I figured I'd do the big overview at the start here. Player of the series for me is going to go to Xiao Hao in the jungle. You don't need me to tell you that Xiao Hao's good. Maybe you do. Maybe you don't watch the channel. Maybe you haven't watched over the past couple of years, but I am maybe the biggest Xiao Hao stan on the entire internet. Tarzan, Xiao Hao. There are a couple of LPL junglers that I've really gone to bat for, and Beishuan's, I guess, a part of that as well, but Xiao Hao might be the number 1 of all of those guys. When he was on AL for so many years, I was the one really kind of talking about how he needed to be on a top team. He didn't get a fair shake last year, but now he's on Edward Gaming, and he's still the best jungler at the bottom of the standings, as he has been throughout his entire career. We're going to talk about a player like Milky Way on the other side of this matchup for RNG that's getting a lot of hype and getting a lot of attention. Xiao Hao is double the player that Milky Way is, and I firmly believe that. I don't even think it's really all that close to compare these two junglers. Xiao Hao is just ridiculous on these carry-oriented types of junglers, and he continues to absolutely dominate every single series that he plays into. There was a big jungle gap in this series, and we're going to talk about that on the side of RNG, but I'm not surprised to see Xiao Hao come out and just be able to outplay and outjungle Milky Way. That's kind of what I expected in a matchup like this, and I think he delivered. The other major piece I would say towards this Edward Gaming victory is Angel in the mid lane, who has not really been exceptional over the course of this year. He's kind of just been there, and that's fine for the most part. That's what Angel was, in my opinion, for a big portion of the early part of his career. He was kind of just a guy for a long time. Even when he was making those World Finals runs, it really was that small stint on Ninjas in Pyjamas that kind of convinced me that he could be more. I think at times he followed that up on OMG last year, but he was also super inconsistent. And again, he's kind of returned to just being, a regular player this year, like a league average player, even a slightly below league average player in terms of the production he's been giving. Xiao Hao has done a lot of the work coming out of the jungle for Edward Gaming and Angel. Not always been able to match that, but this series things were a little bit better, especially on that Silas in game number 1, where things really started to click for him. I like when he gets to play aggressive, and I like when he starts to feel himself from a mechanics perspective. It's not always a position where he can outplay his opponent, and I think that's kind of what we're seeing, is that the mid lane pool is just a little bit too good for him right now at the top of the standings. It's a big reason why this team is in Group Nirvana in the first place, but when he is able to generate pressure like he was in that first game, he still looks good in those situations. They're just significantly more rare. So the jungle mid duo looking good for Edward Gaming, ZDZ, being fine on the top side. That's all you can really ask him to be. He's been a disaster for EDG, but at the very least, he was stable in this series, which is all you can, again, ask for. On and Wink have slowly started to come online. I think they didn't necessarily look like I wanted them to at the beginning when they first got thrust back in as a duo for Edward Gaming, but things are starting to click a little bit better, and, I've kind of had this team as the #1 team in Group Nirvana for basically the entirety of that run. Really, the only time I was concerned was their loss to Ultra Prime, but they pretty easily, amend that loss by, picking up big wins over everyone else in Group Nirvana, so I'm not super worried about Edward Gaming. They've been able to take down most of the competition they needed to go into, and, I'm not going to say they have a good shot to make playoffs or anything, because anyone out of Group Nirvana is going to be an underdog, but Edward Gaming, I think, have the best shot of any team in Group Nirvana to be able to make that happen. And for RNG on the other side, I'm just going to quickly touch upon some narratives. I've already done the positive spin of like, let's look at RNG's past and talk about how historic this organization is and what they've been able to accomplish. Let's get into the reality of this. I think the conversation surrounding some of the players on this roster is just entirely wrong. Milky Way is once again going to get dud of the series, and I'm not going to mince words here. Milky Way has been right up there for one of the least valuable junglers in the entire league. And there's going to be a lot of people that are like, well, Milky Way, we saw what he did on FPX last year. This is a bad situation on RNG. It's just not the team. It's not his fault. It's the team's fault, and there's a lot of, moving parts, and I definitely think that plays into it at the very least. But the truth is, Milky Way is a one-dimensional player. He's a one-tool player, and if he's not able to do that one thing that he's really good at, which is getting resources early, then he can't play the game. Again, the player I always compare him to is Bo, and there's a reason Bo has kind of flamed out of Tier 1 leagues, both here and in Europe, and that's because no team wants to take a risk on trying to win consistently with a player of Bo's caliber because of the lack of versatility and the lack of flexibility that you get when playing through a player like that. And I think Milky Way got figured out a bit in playoffs, and I think he's been a lot worse in 2025. I get that there is upside there, but I'm starting to get to the point where, like, are you asking me would I take a risk on Milky Way right now? Probably not. I would probably let some other team try to fix him and just see what happens. Like, I see this comment so many times, like, oh, NIP Milky Way, free Milky Way. I don't like Aki. I don't think he's good for Ninjas in Pyjamas. That'd be a downgrade for Ninjas in Pyjamas. They would be going to a worse jungler, especially for the way that their team is constructed, where they want to play around bot lane. You think Milky Way and Leave are going to be able to function on the same team together? There's just no way. There's no universe where that ends up being a decision I would ever make, and I get it, right? Like, again, Milky Way has shown a lot of promise, but this entire, like, NIP Milky Way or free Milky Way agenda, I'm just all out on it. I think it's not happening, man. Like, there are other players that I would pick up instantly before Milky Way that might even be teamless right now, and that's just, again, where I'm at. So, Milky Way getting done of this series, I'm not a fan of his game. I do think the scoreline is a lie, and I think he kind of ran the back half of this series. He sold out. Like, he sold in a bad way. This was a bad end to his year if it is going to be that. Niket is the other player that I think people are kind of interested in on RNG. I am much more interested in Niket as an individual player. I do think there's something to unlock there. I don't know how consistently you're going to be able to get it out. He's kind of a worse version of Jway, which is pretty funny because he came in and kind of looks like an upgrade for Ultra Prime last year to Jway when he came in as their starting support. Maybe he has like a Jway-esque 2026 on a better situation. I think that's possible for a player of Niket's caliber, but at least for now, he was also pretty bad in this series. Jiachi, Tongyuan, Xiaoshu, like, they're fine. They're whatever. Xiaoshu's never developed. Tongyuan has been the RNG guy through and through and probably will go down with the organization. Jiachi's fine. He's like the example of a below average AD carry at this level. Not awful, but certainly not groundbreaking. Like, RNG player-wise, it makes sense for them to be in the bottom two. I don't think anybody's particularly surprised with this outcome. It's just a bit disappointing considering the names that they had coming into the year and maybe the expectations, but most of all, the organization recognition. As much as this is about EDG picking up this win and kind of securing their spot near the top and, guaranteeing a top two and, all that jazz, yada, yada, yada. This is mostly about RNG potentially playing their last games ever, and if this was the last split they've ever had, it's unfortunate for such a dominant organization to go out on what is, quite frankly, such a whimper. Then moving on to our second series of day number 6, and it's another top-of-the-table clash. We've gotten a couple of these this week, as we saw Weibo Gaming taking on Anyone's Legend, and thankfully for AL, they're able to pull something back here and stop the losing skid that they were on earlier on in the week. I know it's still not perfect for them by any means, but picking up a win here is absolutely massive, and doing so in pretty dominant fashion, pretty clearly looking like the better team. It's just good process, especially with the players that did indeed end up popping off for for them and kind of carrying them in this series. For Weibo on the other side, honestly, kind of underrated, pretty bad week for them, all things considered. It was kind of a lot going wrong for Weibo ever since that loss to BLG that really stunted a lot of their momentum, and they've not been able to recover it. Who would have guessed that Weibo Gaming goes from being a team that can't lose to a team that can't win in back-to-back little streaks, and that's just how this organization operates. It's been like this every single year for the past couple of years, and it's just who we have to believe Weibo is at this point. Pretty funny to see, but let's go ahead and talk about the games. Tarzan's gonna get player of the series here, and man, did he need it. He was dud of the series in both of their losses earlier this week, and so for him to be able to pick this up is gigantic, and he just mega gapped Tion. Like, this was not even close. Like, actually, there was really not even a conversation to be had around these two. Like, this is one of Tion's worst series in quite a while. Again, he's been leveling up. I think in terms of some of his gameplay, he's definitely been getting a bit more consistent in terms of his execution, and even in their losses, I thought he looked fine earlier in the past couple of series, but Tarzan made him look foolish in this one. Not the only player on Weibo to look pretty bad across this series, as we will get into, but Tarzan was definitely the driving force for anyone's legend, and I'm excited to be able to say that, because boy, did he need this confidence bounce back. We knew that Tarzan was going to be able to figure it out. I'm just glad he didn't go an entire week without being able to get that done for a team that, again, had went up to number 1 in my power rankings just a week ago. KL was really, really solid here on Leona and on Nico. I think the Nico in particular just feels disrespectful to let that through to AL in game number 2, with KL being such a playmaker for this team to kind of allow him the opportunity to be the number 1 option. It's just kind of insane. Like, there's just no justification for him being allowed to have that pick. And then Flandra was pretty good on the top side. He very much dominated Breathe. Breathe has not been playing well as of late. He was on a ridiculous hot streak to start the split. His numbers were incredible. They have very much fallen off in recent weeks, as Breathe has tended to do. Shanks was better. Hope was better. AL just felt a lot cleaner. And I think a lot of that is Tarzan. When Tarzan feels comfortable and can control the map in the way that he wants, things just get easier for anyone's legend. And I think that that is a really big positive to see. And for Weibo on the other side, we already talked about it, but jungle support just was not in this series at all. Erha is going to get my dud of the series in that support position. There must have been 4 or 5 times where that Lulu was caught out in game number 2 with absolutely no justification. And this is like the Weibo support curse. It just happens every single time that Weibo bring in a new support, regardless of who it is. I've been talking about this all year long. Everybody's so quick to blame Hong, the support here for Weibo Gaming, but people forget he was the most consistent support in the entire league before he joined this organization. This org just curses whoever is playing support for them in that role, and in this case, it is Erha, who's just playing way too far forward and is not useful at all. Again, that Lulu game was disastrous, especially after we've seen that champion really be productive over, a couple of series across this week. So didn't have to think too much. Pretty easy choice for dead of the series. Tion, like I said, not good. The Pantheon, the Skarner, out-jungled in both games. Tarzan very much had his number, and quite frankly, Tarzan has had his number. It's not just Tion, it's all of the top junglers here in the LPL that Tarzan pretty consistently beats. Pretty fun to see that, but it definitely continued here. Xiao, who's not keeping that King of Spring form up. We already talked about it a bit, but Breathe has really struggled in terms of keeping form up. Light really wasn't all that bad, but not much he could do, especially when his Lulu was actively running it down in game number 2. It's hard to play Zeri in that instance, but Weibo is just off kilter right now, and it's frustrating because, again, this team is so streaky for both good and bad. The good moments of Weibo look incredible, and they go on these big, massive, white-hot runs, and then they start losing a bunch of games in a row, and guess what? They're not going to be top 4 after this week, I can promise you that, but AL kind of protecting some of their integrity by picking up a win here. It's still a pretty bad week overall for them, especially considering their expectations, but at least they're able to close it out a little bit better across the finish line. But then moving on to our third series of day number 6, closing out our first weekend day. It's a matchup between Team WE and Bilibili Gaming that BLG is going to stomp, slaughter, and I mean like truly slaughter. The only thing getting in their way in this series is themselves, is their own gameplay, because it certainly wasn't WE, who I guess at times put up a bit of a fight. Monkey continues to at the very least be aggressive. I mean, dude's pulling out Graves in game number 2 against Bilibili Gaming, which is certainly like throwing down the gauntlet. I think that that's fair to say, but they gave Knight a Kali, and you know what? I just don't think that that was necessarily a good idea, because boy howdy did he completely take over this game in a way that I just haven't seen in a while. Knight is obviously player of the series. I don't have to tell you why Knight is player of the series. You know why Knight's player of the series if you watched a single second of these games. He obliterated WE in this one, and I know we've already hyped him up so much over the course of this week, but I cannot stress enough, Knight, until proven otherwise, is the best player in the LPL. I don't even think that that's all that debatable. And he is taking that to almost an absurd extreme right now that he feels so much more comfortable with Beishwan in the lineup playing towards him as a jungler. Just ridiculous stuff. I mean, he's on a completely different level right now from everybody else in the league. If he had played like this from the start of the split, there would be no MVP conversation. He would have run away with it in an absolute heartbeat. The last 4 or 5 series that Knight has played, they've been the best 5 series anybody has played in the LPL over the course of this year. That's just where this guy is at in terms of being able to carry games on these melee assassins, and it's just ridiculously fun to watch as well because we want Knight to succeed. This is a guy that I think is making an argument to be the LPL GOAT in terms of the accomplishments and the things he's put out, and you know, he had his final streak snapped in the winter split in split number 1. I don't think it's going to be all that long before he tries to start getting another one of those streaks going, and I think he's on a good trajectory to do so. He's just ridiculous. Karis obviously stood no chance in this series, but the only thing getting in Knight's way was On in the support position, and that's a discredit to On and not a credit to, you know, not a discredit to Knight, because On was just trying to do whatever he could in this series to generate anything, even in a negative way, on the Lux in game 2, just being super aggro. You know, Caitlyn Lux has kind of fallen out of popularity as a Caitlyn bot lane combo, but it can still be pretty effective, as we saw here from Elk and On, if it does end up working out. I do want to give another big shout out to Beishwan, who just had a ridiculously good week, and I'm so happy to see a player like Beishwan, who got shit on so regularly for so much of his LPL career, get a shot on a big tier team and instantly make them better. And I get there's like a narrative right now that any new jungler coming into a team is just immediately going to revitalize them, but I can't be more specific when I say that the reason that BLG is doing well is not because they have a new jungler, it's specifically because they brought in Beishwan and his skill set and the way that he plays the game. He's incredibly smart. He's one of the smartest macro junglers we have in the LPL. He doesn't always have the mechanics to be able to pull off high-level plays, but you don't need the mechanics. You're playing with Bin and Knight and Elk and On, some of the most mechanically talented players in the entire world. You don't need to be the guy that steps up and carries games. If you can get them consistently into positions where they can pop off, that's your job, and that's exactly what Beishwan has been able to do. That Xin Zhao game in game 1, he is really starting to get comfortable on that champion after some rough outings at the beginning of the split, and the Poppy looked incredible. He's just awesome. He was the second best player on Bilibili again in this series, and he was the best player in their previous win, so, you know, I'm pretty in on Beishwan, even with Monkey performing well on the other side. Bin is starting to get back into form. He is not dying in side lanes nearly as much. It feels like he's locking in mentally. We already talked about the bot lane. BLG is just clicking on all cylinders, and of course WE doesn't have like an easy answer to that. Of course they're not going to be a team that can actually go in to a fully powered Bilibili gaming. This was my number 1 versus number 16 team in my preseason power rankings. Now, of course, things haven't necessarily turned out like that for either of them so far this split, both for good and for bad, but you know, WE don't have the firepower, and Karis in particular is not going to be able to go up against a fully powered Knight who clearly is trying to prove a point right now. He is going to be done of the series, and I can't even really blame him. Is it entirely his fault? No, he just doesn't have the talent to be able to beat Knight. It really is as simple as that. He plays Talia, and he just tries to be useful for the team, and he can't even really do that. Cube had a really bad week, I would say, on the top side. As a weak side top laner that just needs to be able to survive when he goes up against these really good teams, it becomes very difficult to project him to do better than, you know, poor against them because his mechanics are so bad. And this is what people mean when they say that WE is playing like 100x their skill level and, you know, they're kind of raising everybody up. I don't mean to say that everybody on this team is bad, right? Monkey's an interesting player. I think Taiyun and Vampire have made strides over the course of this split, but rather they're not just competing with okay teams in the LPL. They're competing with upper echelon Group Ascend teams in the LPL, and that's where WE, you know, talent-wise, mechanics-wise, just don't really stand a chance to be able to go up against these types of teams, and BLG really proved that here today. Vampire definitely on the back foot in comparison to everything going on with Beishwan, and even On, who was playing really aggro. You know, Taiyun and Monkey, like we said, were trying. Monkey maybe a little bit too much, but overall, like, WE at least put it all out on the Rift, and they got obliterated, but they tried. Like, they put it out there, and they weren't afraid to go and make plays, but Bilibili was not to be deterred across this entire week. Easily the best team in the LPL across week number 6, and I don't even think there's really a debate for anybody else. But then moving on now to day number 7, our final day of the week here in the LPL in this mega week that we have. And to start day number 7, it's our final Group Nirvana matchup and the final series that I commentated this week, Ultra Prime taking on LGD Gaming. And LGD is going to pick up the 2-1 series win. They are going to secure their spot not only at 4-1 and in the play-in stage, but as the number 1 team from Group Nirvana in terms of the results. I don't think a lot of people expected that coming coming into the Group Nirvana stage, but you know what? This team delivered, and they really stepped up when it mattered the most. Their roster change coming in to the jungle there, and Nio, coming in to be their starting jungler has really paid off for LGD, and this team is looking incredible now. I'm not saying that they're favorites to take anything off of, the upper tier teams coming down from Group Ascend, but this is a scary team that you have to face in a best of 5. They're certainly not a pushover by any means. For Ultra Prime, it means they are not going to be a part of that upper tier, that upper echelon. However, I don't think things are nearly as dire as maybe you would assume. Of course, they're not in bottom 2 either, which means they will get to play in Summer Split, and I do think there are some things to build on for this team. They try out a couple of different configurations because things were mostly set in stone for them going into the series. Baya gets a run in game number 1, even if it isn't for any more than that. Wako coming back in to play the rest of the series, but definitely some interesting pieces to take away. Some players here that I think are playing really well. Junhao in particular, that just didn't quite have the firepower to get over the hump needed to get the team into the top 2, but we'll talk about it. Again, for LGD, player of the series for me is going to go to Sasi on the top side. Really nice series from him, and honestly, he's a really intriguing player. Reminds me a ton of a player that we have talked about a couple of times this week in Solo Kill for Ninjas in Pyjamas that, is just kind of a very aggressive player with good hands on a bad team that doesn't have like a full skill set yet. I think that there is a world where he turns into a player that can be a little bit more interesting than whatever the results he's getting this year will be. But that being said, there still is a lot to take away from the current year performances that might even be better than what we saw ahead of other players that might have been in worse spots. He played really well on the Mbessa in game number 1. That's the game where you're going to look at the tape and just see him opening up all of these avenues for the rest of the team to really pop off in a lot of these fights. But the Udyr in game 3 is kind of that last-ditch effort. We were talking about it on the cast, but you can throw everything at the wall in game number 3 because there's nothing left to play for. LGD only needed to win 1 game in this series in order to qualify, but winning the series gets them into that number 1 spot. So they were just kind of throwing everything at the wall, seeing what stuck, playing what they wanted to, and that equated to playing Udyr, Caitlyn, Karma in that third and final game. And you know what? The Udyr was also pretty valuable. Wasn't the most valuable champion in the entire universe, but especially comboing that with the Mbessa in game number 1, I think it was fair to give him player of the series, and he's one of the players I really am excited about on this team. I do want to give a shout out to Zhao Qinghua in the mid lane as well. I thought he actually had a pretty good game number 3 on the Yone and a couple of really nice taunts in game 1 on the Galio to really disrupt a lot, but the Annie game in game 2 very much kept him out of player of the series, I guess, capabilities and, player of the series running. You got to play well the entire series, and he did not do that. Nio was pretty solid coming out of the jungle. The Pantheon, the Sejuani, both of them looked fine. Xiaoya looked really good in game number 3 on the Caitlyn. Ended up really popping off in some of those late game team fights, which you don't normally associate with Caitlyn, but still pretty solid. And YCX was also good enough, like exactly what you would anticipate. LGD is a good team, and they are better than a lot of teams in Group Nirvana. Do I think they have some sort of ridiculous upside that's yet to be tapped into? Probably not. I just don't think that this is the kind of org that's going to be able to get the most out of these kinds of players, and, this is a very young roster still, and it's going to be a tough challenge, but you know what? Congrats to them for even being in this position in the first place to earn themselves a best of 5 to qualify for playoffs. And for Ultra Prime, you're going to be sad that you weren't able to be in that position. This team probably should have been in Group Ascend if you go back and remember the last chance qualifier coming out of the placement stage where they were, 2-2 essentially against WE, losing that final series 2-1 to allow WE to go to Group Ascend, and they had to go down to Group Nirvana. I think some people, me included, expected them to keep that form up and to be able to qualify for, a play-in stage spot. It just didn't really end up happening. Again, they throw some stuff at the wall here. Baye in game number 1, who looked fine, not necessarily fantastic, but certainly not awful either. And then Wako comes back in for games 2 and 3, where he does look fine. Again, much better in game 2 than he did in game 3, where I don't think he played particularly well, but outside of that, just not really a lot to talk about when it comes to Ultra Prime in this series. Jung is going to get my dead of the series, which is unfortunate because he was very valuable on the Shen in game number 2, but the Yorick in game 1 and the Cassante in game 3 both were complete non-factors, and especially with his opposing top laner really taking over, Sasi on the other side, just not really a series to remember for Jung, even if he did have that second game. Saber also needed to be a bit more in the mid lane, and I think we've been constantly saying that for him throughout a lot of this split, where it's just like, you're so close to being somebody that can compete near the top of like Group Nirvana and, be relevant with a lot of these middle tier mid laners, like Angel, that have kind of set the bar where he needs to stand, and unfortunately he's just not been able to capitalize on that. Pretty decent Rise game, but outside of that, not much to talk about. Xiaoxia, whatever. But Junhao, Junhao's awesome. If you're going to talk about a player that I do kind of want to get taken by Ninjas in Pyjamas that I think can get picked up and be a potential upgrade to Aki, Junhao is the guy I'm looking at as a potential carry threat, if that is on the table. Of course, I'm sure Ultra Prime money-wise would be happy to sell almost any player that gets any offers, but This guy statistically is right up there with any other jungler in the entire league. We did a full segment on it on the broadcast, so check that out if you are interested. But he is definitely the star here of Ultra Prime, and it's going to be a shame he doesn't get a chance to play a best of 5. But at the end of the day, Ultra Prime is Ultra Prime, right? This is the expected outcome for this organization, if not for this group of players, and so you're not too shocked. But LGD with this win does get that #1 spot, and Group Nirvana closes out the entirety of the Group Nirvana stage in a pretty decent situation, and overall just looks like a fun team. I'm really excited to see this group of rookies actually stepping up in year 1. Then moving on to our second series of day number 7, and we're not done with the upsets just yet, as we had Thunder Talk Gaming taking on Weibo Gaming, and Thunder Talk is going to pick up the 2-1 series win. A team that looked completely inept for a majority of this week ends up picking up their only win of week number 6. It's kind of an important one. It doesn't really matter what ends up happening to them at this point, but just finding an opportunity to know how to win with this comp and with this group of players is ginormous for their chances as they head into these best of 5s. Remember, they're guaranteed a best of 5 no matter what because they are in Group Ascend. It's just going to be a bit more of a difficult one because of, the fact that they are at the bottom. They're going to be the 10th place team coming out of Group Ascend, but man, Way Bad Gaming is back, and we just can't catch a break. These Weibo believers, we can't sit here and be happy for any extended period of time. It's always got to come crashing down historically bad at some point, and that's exactly what ended up happening here. Weibo had a miserable week, about as bad as you could possibly ask for, and trust me, I'm going to eviscerate them when we talk about how they played this series, but we talk about the winning team first, so let's get into Thunder Talk. We've said so much about them already this week that I honestly don't think there's going to be a lot that I can say that's different, just, instead of being bad, they were good instead. But player of the series is going to go to Xiao Huangren in the jungle, and man, did we need to see this kind of performance from him to know that this was even really possible in the first place. The big concern for me was just, is this guy like the worst jungler in the league or what? Like, he was looking horrendous in his first couple of series, and I'm still not willing to completely buy in, again, if only just because I've been very anti his tape. Like, again, going and watching his LDL tape, it's just not particularly impressive in my opinion. I think a lot of people, especially on Reddit and on Twitter, that are like, this guy is such a hyped prospect. They're doing that because somebody else told them that he's a super hyped prospect. There's not really been a lick of development in the last 5 years, and so, it's cool to see him be able to perform here, but Way Bad Gaming was definitely not stepping up to the plate to necessarily stop him here today. It really is just the Zyra game that he's getting this player of the series for. He was okay on the Xin Zhao and on the Vi in particular in game number 2, but again, he really took over on Zyra, and we're going to need to see him play more aggressive, specifically AP junglers, I think, because I think that plays into the strengths of Thunder Talk elsewhere on the map with Satab in the mid lane playing something like Yasuo here in game 3, but I think it's very clear that he needs to play carries. He cannot play facilitators. He cannot play tanks. He's not the guy who's going to come in and play Sejuani for this team. He's not going to play Skarner. He's not Beishwan. He's not the same kind of player. You need to let him do his own things, and I think they finally started to figure that out in this series, and it did kind of work out for them. Big ups to 1xN as well. Him and Feather, I think, played much better in this series than they had throughout the rest of the week. I'm still pretty low on 1xN as a player. Again, not because I think he's bad, but because I think he's average. I think he's the definition of a league average 80 carry at this level, and you got to hope that he's eventually going to grow into more. I don't really have a ton of hope that that's going to happen, but this was a good series to showcase that it is very much possible. Light is a very talented AD carry who's been successful at this level for a very long time. 1xN was better than him in this series, even if he did receive significantly more resources, we will say. Feather was much better as an engaged threat, especially in game 3. On the Alistar, Satab felt a lot more comfortable. Again, get him on Yasuo, get him on Yone, these more aggressive, melee mids that he is known for. I don't want to see him on Orianna. Like, that's where he's going to get run down and just not be a competitive player. Victor, I don't want to see those kinds of things. Let him do the things he's good at and let Hoya just do whatever he wants. On the top side, I cannot believe that this top lane matchup ended up going the way that it did. Breathe had been on fire at the start of this year. He has cooled off to ice cold, we'll just say. If Hoya is kind of gapping you on the top side, that's how you know things are getting pretty bad. So it's a nice win for Thunder Talk. Does it really change my perception of this team? Not really, but at least we know they can win if given the right circumstances with this group of 5. And then for Weibo on the other side, come on, man. Like, what do I do here? How do I even talk about this? This team is just they suck. They're so bad, and it's so frustrating, man, because they were so good for so long before this streak where they just turned bad again. And I know that this happens. I call them way bad gaming for a reason, because this isn't the first time on this channel that we've had to discuss a Weibo gaming cold streak immediately after a Weibo gaming hot streak against upper tier competition. But the fact that this is happening regardless of who is on the roster and what the iteration looks like, it's just got to be so frustrating for a lot of these players. Breathe is going to get dud of the series for me. It's just not justifiable for him to be down 40 CS into Hoya. Like, there's no way to be able to get away with that, and for me not to get frustrated with the way that things went down. Breathe needs to be better than this, and he just has not been. You know, keep an eye out for Dud of the Week. He's definitely going to be a big front runner on that, which is crazy considering how highly I've talked about him throughout a majority of this split. Also worth noting that Xiaohu has gotten a lot worse since the start of spring. The Spring King has not been able to keep the spring form up so far, at least towards the back half. Erha had a really bad week. You know, Light was fine. Tian, I don't think was the problem this series for Weibo, but they need to figure this shit out, because if they don't make playoffs, which by the way is a super realistic outcome for them, they're not going to have an easy free best of 5 with the place that they're going to fall in the standings. And if they don't make playoffs, it's the biggest disaster of a split that they could possibly ask for. And you know what? They're getting cold at the exact wrong time. They have to figure it out, and they have to figure it out now. But this is a nice win for Thunder Talk. Again, it doesn't really mean anything for the standings. They're still, you know, pretty far down there, and, you know, spoiler alert, they're going to be one of our first teams that are officially locked out of being able to qualify for top 4. Not that they're really fighting it out for that, but they're prepping themselves for a playoff, you know, qualification, a play-in best of 5, and I think this was a series that shows that there is at least something to play through with this roster. But that's going to bring us to our final series of the week here. And again, if you've made it this far, I really appreciate you sticking with me through this video. I know it can be a long one, but our final series of the week certainly is a good one. It's JD Gaming taking on Top Esports, and TES is going to pick up the 2-0 to close out week number 6. They're going to look very good at the end of the week, and you know what? They may have remade their case to be the #1 team in the LPL right now, and I'm certainly not going to push super hard against that. I think that there is a lot to like about where Top Esports is at. The only concerning loss that they have over the course of this entire phase, really, at least from a majorly concerning perspective, is that Anyone's Legend loss at the end of last week, and they kind of avenged that this week, and AL certainly didn't look good, but JDG really had no answer to Top Esports, who were just the better team in basically every single area. I see a lot of people trying to pinpoint the blame on 1 or 2 members, and while I do think this is kind of a team loss, I think that the overall conversation surrounding JD Gaming is just so unbelievably misguided, and as per usual, a lot of LPL Reddit and, you know, some LPL social media circles don't really seem to have an opinion that I can respect in this case when it comes to JD Gaming, which we will get into. But let's go ahead and talk about Top Esports first and foremost. Player of the series for me is going to go to Jackie Love in the bot lane. He is on fire right now. I think he's honestly getting a bit underrated in terms of just how good he's been over the past couple of weeks. I know Kanavi is kind of winning the MVP argument right now for me and for a lot of people, and trust me, Kanavi played awesome in this series, and I considered him for player of the series. 369 had a really fantastic week for Top Esports and looked really good across multiple different series. It feels like Cream is, you know, maybe not playing perfect, but is much more controlled than maybe he has been in some previous splits, is not making as many negative plays, but I really do think over the last 2 to 3 weeks in particular, Jackie Love's probably been the best player on Top Esports. He has reemerged as one of the best AD carries in the world. It really felt like a matter of time. Like, I didn't expect Jackie to go the entire year feeling like, you know, a top 6 AD carry. It was kind of inevitable that he was eventually going to get back into that top 2 conversation, and he's done exactly that. And it's off the back of his ridiculous mechanical plays, exactly what you want to see from Jackie Love. Now, that being said, you know, I'm not throwing away the scouting report that I gave you at the beginning of the split either, when I told you that he has gotten a lot more calm and controlled, and he starts to play with a little bit more of his head than just his heart and his hands now, like he used to. I do think that as a well-rounded player, he still has carried a lot of those attributes over, but I think he is realizing that that aggression is kind of what makes him him, and like what gets him a lot of the leads that he does end up utilizing throughout a lot of these games, and he's just gone back to really prioritizing that. So credit to Jackie Love, excited for him on that front. Like I said, top side of the map was excellent here. 369 and Kanavi played really well. 369 mega gapped Ala on the other side, which we will talk about. And Shun, who's also been very good for JD Gaming, regardless of what Reddit wants to tell you, was just not quite as good as Kanavi in this one, who kind of played his signature champ into his other signature champ in the Kindred versus Nidalee matchup in game number 2. Pretty funny there. Like I said, Cream was good, especially on the Yone. Crisp was solid. I actually like him on Enchanters. I know it doesn't necessarily fit his style because he is such a big player, playmaker, but I do think it generally fits the idea, and Top Esports is a really good team despite what people want, right? Like, this team is still a favorite to represent the region at MSI regardless of their international shortcomings. Their domestic performances have been nothing short of fantastic, and for JD Gaming on the other side, unfortunately, it just comes back to the same issues that they've had regularly. Pays is really good, and I think, you know, a lot of JDG fans can acknowledge that, but I think where I kind of draw the line is a lot of fans kind of say to throw out the rest of the roster, like throw out all 4 of the other members, keep Pays. I saw that comment multiple times in multiple different avenues after this series, and I think that that is just like a lack of media literacy. Like, there's basically no other way for me to competently say that. Like, you can't be watching the same games that I am and say that this is entirely the fault of, you know, anyone but Pays. Like, there are clearly things that are going more wrong than the others here, and a lot to build around. First of all, Shun is in the MVP conversation in terms of just how good he's been across this split. I know I've said that about a lot of players, but, you know, you're really looking at, I would say, like 6 or 7 guys who are like up there fighting it out for a top 3 spot, depending on how the split ends up ending, the regular season ends up ending. And Scout's really not been all that bad, despite what Reddit will tell you. I think generally his numbers are okay. He might not be the most dominant mid laner in the world, but he does his job, which is play towards late game team fights. This is the same kind of defending I did for Xiaohu for many years in the mid lane before he had that crash out last year. But it's top and support that really continue to be the problem. And that's where I will agree that you got to throw it out, man. Allah has just been absolutely nothing for this team. He's going to get dead of the series here, got mega gapped by 369. This is the worst year of his career, and it's not even remotely close. It's very frustrating because, like we've said a couple of times, they brought him in to be an upgrade to that double top they had last year in Flandra and Sheer, who both have gone on to be better than Allah in 2025. So not a great look there, and missing has genuinely just been bad. Now, he's had some more highs, I would say, than some of the other, you know, supports that we talk about just being really bad, but the lows are really, really low, especially when this team is trying to get top 3. You can't really be having results like this where missing just gets completely outplayed by Crisp and isn't really competitive in any of these games. Missing wasn't even very good last year. It felt like that decline had already started in 2024, and it's just carried over even more into 2025. And so, yes, do I believe that Pays is stuck on this team a bit right now, but I do think he's carrying them enough to potentially be top 4. I just think Top Esports is better than that. This is still probably the best team in the LPL, and despite their loss last week, I think they bounced back really well and kind of reproved that in week number 6. All right, but that is going to do it for my LPL week number 6 overview and analysis video here in the spring split. Up on the screen, the standings after 6 weeks of action. A lot of movement because, as we know, a ton of games played over the course of the LPL week. Thank you again for sticking around over an hour and a half into this video if you are still here, but you can see to the right of every single team's ranking a power ranking, where I personally power rank these teams from number 1 to number 16, and that, you know, stretches across both Group Ascend and Group Nirvana. Change is going to be how they have changed from last week to this week, so we can go over any risers or fallers to talk about here quite a bit, actually, in the LPL this week, because I think we did get a clearer picture of what exactly the top of the standings look like. First and foremost, Top Esports reclaiming their role at the top of the power rankings. At least for now, they're the best team in the LPL until proven otherwise, although the team moving up to number 2 in my power rankings definitely has something to say about that, and that's the newly invigorated BLG, the reinvigorated BLG, Bilibili Gaming, going all the way back up to number 2. I honestly feel they are this good. I honestly would be shocked if they're not competing to win the finals right now. It's between them and Top Esports, who I would consider the favorite to take the finals, to take the LPL trophy, and right now, if I had to tell you who I think will be representing the region at MSI, I think it will be Top Esports and BLG. That unfortunately leaves out anyone's legend. It feels like just their luck as an org to get so close to making it to first stand and not be able to get over the hump, to be so close to make it to MSI and not be able to get over the hump. But this week scared me. I'm going to be entirely honest. This was a bad week for anyone's legend. They need to be able to figure things out and stabilize at least a little bit, because especially that loss to Bilibili Gaming was concerning with just, are they going to be good enough to repeat the performance that they had in the winter split where they made finals if the other teams in the league are going to be playing better? JDG going to fall down to number 4 to make room for BLG, but this is the exact same team they were going into the week. A very good team on their best day, and a team that I doubt can compete with the upper echelon. And then 5 and 6 are the same team. And I'm sorry, if you want to put them in, you know, swapped orders, I think that that's totally fine. I'm keeping Weibo ahead of Invictus Gaming, but Weibo at 5, IG at 6. They're the same team. I'm sorry, they are. They're so flippy on a game-to-game basis. Whoever's playing worse on any given day can be the team that gets number 6, and the team that plays better can get number 5. This week, Invictus was better than Weibo. Do I think that's going to continue? Probably not, because Invictus is not going to be able to keep a hot streak up, and Weibo's not going to be bad for the entire time. But it's not going to be the flip side of that, and the the entire time either. Like, these are the same team in my perception, so they're going to get 5 and 6 for now. Ninjas and Pyjamas jumping back up to number 7. I've been wanting to put them at number 7 for a while because I just don't trust WE and FPX and Thunder Talk to be these kinds of teams with their rosters to compete at that level, but they finally proved that they deserve to be there this week. Now, will they be able to actually put that into practice? Maybe not. And honestly, with the way that things are working out, who knows if they're going to be able to grab a playoff spot, but if they do run into a team like WE in the best of 5 stage, I would imagine that they should be favorites to win a series like that. That being said, WE drops down to 8, FPX drops down to 9, and Thunder Talk for now stays at 10 with that victory they had over Weibo at the end of the week. If they didn't get that, they probably would be down at number 13. In terms of my power rankings, that's genuinely how I feel about Thunder Talk. They are one small step away from being what I consider a group Nirvana, middle of the pack type of team, worse than either of the two teams at the top of group Nirvana. But as you can see with the color coordination, Top Esports has guaranteed themselves top 4, which means they're guaranteed for playoffs. They don't need to play the play-in stage. You know, we expected them to be there, but it means they are guaranteed one of those main spots. And Thunder Talk has guaranteed themselves for play-ins, which means that they can no longer get top 4, but we kind of expected them to not get that anyways. And then Group Nirvana's not having any power ranking changes, only 2 series this week to close out the entirety of Group Nirvana, and no real surprises. We can see the color coordination there. LGD and EDG are going to be the 2 teams playing in the play-ins. They will play the number 5 and number 6 teams respectively from Group Ascend in a best of 5 in order to try and upset everybody and qualify for playoffs. LNG and Ultra Prime don't make play-ins, but they are only eliminated for the rest of this split. They will be coming back in summer. The same cannot be said for OMG and RNG, who are done for the year, not just for the spring split. They don't get to play another stage game, and maybe in both of their cases, another game ever as an organization, at least in 2025, maybe beyond. So unfortunately for them, they are done, but those are my power rankings. Let me know what you agree with or disagree with down in the comments section below. But let's go ahead and move on to my player of the week and my dud of the week here in week number 6. If you recognize the graphic that's up on the screen for Player of the Week, that's because I didn't have to change it from week number 5 to week number 6. Once again, for back-to-back weeks, Player of the Week is going to go to Knight, the mid laner for Bilibili Gaming. He's just on fire right now, truly playing like easily the best player in the LPL once again. And you know what? Like I said, if he had done this even just like 2 or so weeks earlier and turned his season around then, he'd probably be leading the MVP conversation right now. As it is, he's just been unbelievable the past 2 weeks, and if he's going to be able to keep it up, he's the big reason why I believe that Bilibili could actually be favorites to win the entire LPL right now if they are able to lock in. You can see the Sylas, the Yone, the Akali. I left out an incredible Sylas game in the WE series as well. Like, that's just where Knight is at. Like, I can't even fit more than, 3 fantastic games onto the screen. I just had to pick the 3 that I think identified him the most, so I picked 1 from each series that he dominated across this week, but this was not a difficult decision. And then my honorable mentions, Jue, the support for FPX. He's been up here before, and he's up here again. This guy is just running things for FPX when this team is doing well. It's almost entirely through him. And yeah, I know there's some ups and downs with that team in general, but they pull off some gigantic wins over good teams, and a lot of that is because of Jue. And then Gala, the AD carry for Invictus. I don't think anybody who watched the IG games this week is going to disagree with this super heavily. He was the stability point and really the carry for that team throughout a lot of week number 6. So Gala and Jue are my honorable mentions. And then my dud of the week is unfortunately going to go to Breathe, the top laner for Weibo Gaming. I hinted at this in their loss to Thunder Talk, but Breathe was awful this week, and you know what? I kind of expected this. We all kind of saw this coming. There is just never a stretch of time where Breathe is consistently good across an entire split, and he was so good at the start of it that you knew it had to crash down eventually. It's just unfortunate that it happened here in week 6 to coincide with the rest of Weibo also really underperforming, but to me, he was clearly the worst player here. If you wanted to put someone like Xiao Huangra in there, I think that that's fair considering how bad he looked, but he was good against Weibo. That kind of, dissuaded me from doing that. I think you could also realistically maybe even put someone like Tarzan here for dud of the week because of those 2 poor series from AL, but again, he kind of turned things around at the end of the week when he locked in and picked up another big win over Weibo, as everybody seems to be doing, but Weibo is the common theme here, and that's why Breathe is going to get my dud of the week and Knight is going to get my player of the week. But that's going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. Of course, we're going to be posting about the rest of the LPL split every, hopefully, Monday on this channel moving forward, but we also cover all 3 of the other major regions, so LTA, North, LEC, and LCK every single week. We also cover the NACL Tier 2 over in North America, so if you want a comprehensive overview of everything going on in LoL Esports, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But with all that being said, I hope you are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all